They had every chance to save that child's life, and they didn't.
It was the death of 7-year-old Chandler Graffner that began our investigation of the Denver Department of Human Services 2.5 years ago. He was removed from the custody of his grandmother, Sandy Younger, and given to guardians, John Phillips and Sarah Berry, who Chandler later told teachers and police had abused him.
You just do not get bruises like that on your body. You just don't, unless you have just been pummeled.
Amy Domansky was Chandler's teacher and friend.
And what did he say had happened?
That his dad had clobbered him. And those were his exact words.
We uncovered reports documenting signs of abuse, yet the child was left in what became a house of horrors. 3 months later, the agency had another chance to save him. Our investigation found a hotline call from teachers to Denver Human Services, and it noted, child has not been seen in school since March.
I think every day went by and we all wondered, why weren't we getting any phone calls? Why isn't anyone calling in to tell us, you know, we've gone to the house, this is what we found.
But we found the complaint was never investigated. A month later, 7-year-old Chandler Graffner was found starved to death in a closet. John Phillips and Sarah Berry were convicted in his torture and murder.
She was beautiful. My granddaughter was beautiful.
4 months after the death of Chandler Graffner, the body of 3-year-old Nevaeh Gallegos was found stuffed in a bag, dumped in a ravine in northwest Denver. Our investigation found her mother, Miriam, had been living with a convicted sex offender, Angel Ray Montoya, and we uncovered records showing the Denver Department of Human Services knew he had likely sexually abused her. Despite the protest of Nevaeh's grandmother, Janet Gallegos, the agency never removed the child from her mother.
They just said they were just going to do counseling.
What did you want?
I wanted something to protect the baby.
Angel Ray Montoya and Miriam Gallegos are now being held for the murder of the child. Under pressure from our reporting that showed a consistent pattern of incompetence and poor judgment, the mayor of Denver ordered a third-party review of the Human Services Agency.
I think the questions you're raising are directly related to, do we have the right procedures in place? I think that ultimately that responsibility is mine to sit down and sift through the consultants and say, do we have a systemic problem or do we have a personnel issue?
As the review was underway, we uncovered even more fatal errors. 3-month-old Luz Valdez died of a head injury.
He handed me the baby and she was limp. She wasn't breathing right.
Her mother had reported a month earlier that her boyfriend, Isidoro Valdez Ruelas, was dropping the child in anger. Denver Human Services closed the case, never having interviewed the alleged perpetrator. The boyfriend was later convicted of killing her.
I wanted to talk to you about a few things that we've been looking at.
We confronted the former director of Denver Human Services, Roxanne White, who had refused to talk about the cases.
If the person is accused of abuse, then that person should be interviewed.
Absolutely, they should be interviewed.
The alleged perpetrator wasn't interviewed. Was that a mistake?
Yes, that's a mistake.
And our investigation found that mistake was repeated once again in the death of yet another child, 2-year-old Jocelyn Asbury.
Every person who is in the house and has caretaking responsibilities for the children should be interviewed.
But when caseworkers visited the home after reports from Jocelyn's school that her sister had been injured by her stepfather, he was never interviewed. 6 weeks later, Alexis Ortiz was convicted in her death.
We've added quite a bit of structure to the process, and we've done 2 rounds of that to make certain that staff really understand what needs to be done in risk and safety under the new changes.
The new changes were mandated with the release of a scathing report from the third-party review last year, a review prompted by our investigation. It found that caseworkers had not been properly assessing the risk to children and thereby leaving them in danger, and that a basic checklist for interviews was not being followed, nor reviewed by supervisors.
Before an assessment is closed, we've instituted a very thorough checklist of what all the worker has to make certain they have done.
And the director announced new hires to manage overloaded caseworkers.
We have made certain that we have added a high-level child protection division director.
But as the review was released, Roxanne White resigned as head of Denver Human Services, leaving it to others to implement any changes.
There were mistakes, people made mistakes, they're going to correct them, they're already retraining people.
Meanwhile, the investigation into child deaths was expanded to 13 statewide. Deaths that were found to have been preventable.
We as a state and we as a community should be outraged.
That prompted Governor Bill Ritter to require immediate remedial training for county caseworkers statewide and additional data entry resources to track cases. And he signed an executive order creating a child welfare action group to make recommendations for changing the state child welfare system. Given our investigation of additional deaths and a continuing pattern of apparent mistakes by DHS, what has really changed? And what about the promises made by state officials? Coming up, are the state's most vulnerable children really any safer?
If we have a system that at any level is failing children, whether it's a county system or a state system, we have to change it, we have to improve it.
We requested an initial investment of 40 additional FTEs to handle the increase in workload that is happening right now.
Caseworkers at Denver Human Services were elated when former director Roxanne White told them that $2 million had been allocated for additional staffing that managers said was a key to child safety. The agency's website touted its progress, noting earlier this year the department has hired 36 case-carrying staff and supervisors, 2 child welfare legal staff, and 2 family crisis center staff. But in fact, our investigation found there were no additional hires.
Did you know until recently that 40 people hadn't been hired?
No, I didn't.
In February, we conducted an analysis of city personnel records and found that 40 people were hired over 12 months, but only to replace those who were fired or who left the agency.
There's a significant budget crisis going on, and they're trying to put their thumbs in a lot of different dikes, and that they didn't keep their eye on the ball.
The new director of Denver Human Services claims the agency can't afford the new caseworkers and believes they're not critical.
What we have focused on are changes in practice, changes in supervision, changes in what we do when we intervene in a case, and how we make referrals to appropriate services. Those are the things that keep children safe.
But caseworkers and other sources inside the agency tell us 2 additional deaths we have recently investigated speak in part to how the now reduced staff simply doesn't have time to adequately address the situation of every child.
The kind of bold, dramatic reforms that are absolutely critical to keep kids safe have not been implemented.
Sherry Shink is the founder and executive director of the Rocky Mountain Children's Law Center and a member of the Governor's Child Action Committee, a committee that has now made recommendations for sweeping changes in the state's child welfare system.
The fatality report talked about 13 preventable deaths. We now have 2 more preventable deaths. We've never resourced our system adequately since the last recession.
A November follow-up report on last year's third-party review, a review prompted by our investigation, makes clear that many of the needed changes in Denver have not been made due to the national economic downturn, causing cuts in service and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty about the future.
There's just a total lack of consistency across the 64 counties in how different agencies or law enforcement and human services respond.
At the state level, Governor Bill Ritter has embraced the recent recommendations of the Child Action Committee that would bring more state control and oversight. And in the past 2 weeks, a federal report giving Colorado a failing grade in child protection has verified much of what we found in our investigation and given the governor an even further sense of urgency.
My view was the system was inferior to what we could design to protect kids, and that was made obvious by the number of child deaths, and you know that, and you reported on it. So what I think this does, it validates our sense that this system needs improving.
Among the most important recommendations by the Child Action Committee, a state training academy for caseworkers to ensure consistency in training statewide. Better trained caseworkers may have saved Luz Valdez and Jocelyn Asbury had they interviewed known perpetrators who eventually killed the children. The training program is already operating. The committee recommends a child advocate outside the normal system who could be called by anyone who believed a case was not getting proper attention or if a child is at risk. Such an advocate could have saved the life of Chandler Graffner. A centralized state hotline would ensure every child abuse call gets a proper response regardless of which county is involved. A uniform response might have prompted removal of Angel D. Herrera from the foster home where he died, unsupervised in the backyard in a trampoline accident.
There are some things we've already done based upon recommendations, things that we can do in this next legislative session. This report says there's an urgency to do that. At the end of the day, it's not about systems, it's about children. We have a long way to go to ensure that we're doing all we can to protect kids.
So now, in a period when the state government is cutting hundreds of millions of dollars from its budget, the question is, will the legislature act? Or will the most vulnerable children of Colorado continue to be failed and forsaken? I'm John Ferrugia, and our investigation continues.